Hi, enjoy listening. The bus groaned to a stop on the edge of a cracked two-lane road that sliced through endless fields of rust-colored grass. The air smelled like dust and pine. Ethan Walker stepped off with a single duffel bag over his shoulder, the soles of his thrift store boots crunching gravel beneath him. There wasn't a soul around. Just the wind, a few rustling crows overhead, and the creak of a sagging mailbox that hadn't seen a letter in years. The house loomed a few yards ahead, partially hidden behind a scrim of overgrown shrubs and a leaning fence that had given up holding anything in. So this was it, Red Pine Hollow, his new home. Ethan stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle over him. This wasn't the first unfamiliar roof he'd lived under. Group homes, foster houses, temporary shelters. But this was different. This one had his name on the deed, courtesy of the state. A transitional housing program for aged-out youth, they had called it. What it really meant was, "Here, kid, you're on your own now." The house was a single-story structure that looked like it had been forgotten by both time and paint. One shutter hung crookedly by a single hinge. The porch was half swallowed by weeds, and the steps sagged like tired bones. But it had a roof, and four walls, and maybe, just maybe, a shot at something like stability. Ethan walked up to the door, which stuck when he pushed it. It groaned open, like it didn't want to be disturbed. The air inside smelled like dust, mold, and something sour. Cobwebs veiled the corners. A broken lampshade lay on the floor. The fridge hummed, but was empty. The sink sputtered brown water for 5 seconds before running clear. But it was his. He dropped his bag on the floor and stood in the center of the room, listening to the echo of his own breath. The next week passed in a kind of slow, suspended motion. Ethan cleaned, scrubbed walls, knocked down cobwebs, patched holes with duct tape, fixed a leak in the roof with a tarp he found in the shed out back. His hands blistered, his back ached, but each small repair made the place feel a little less like someone else's discard and a little more like his own start. There were no neighbors nearby. The town itself, if it could be called that, lay 5 miles east. A huddle of buildings along Main Street. A gas station, a diner, a post office, and not much else. The locals eyed him with suspicion when he showed up to buy soap and canned food. But he was used to that. People didn't trust what they didn't understand, especially someone with no family, no past, and no reason to stay. But he stayed anyway. Because what else did he have? It was at the end of his 2nd week, while patching the floorboards near the back door, that a voice called out from the yard. "You that kid the county sent out here?" Ethan straightened. A man stood outside the fence, leaning on a cane. He was maybe in his 70s, wiry but solid, with sharp eyes under a frayed ball cap. A brown work vest hung over his flannel shirt, and a worn leather belt held a sheathed knife on one side. "Yes, sir," Ethan replied carefully. "Ethan Walker?" The old man squinted. "Walter Briggs, gamekeeper for the Red Pines. Forest line's about a mile from here. You ever been in a forest, Ethan?" "Only when they took us on trips from the group home," Ethan said. "But I liked it." Walter gave a grunt that might have been a laugh. "I'm getting too old to do this job on my own. Can't keep up with the poachers, the traps, the busted fencing. County says they won't hire anyone full-time, but they'll approve a paid assistant if I find one myself." He looked Ethan up and down. "You want work, boy?" Ethan blinked. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a trial," Walter said. "You last 2 weeks without whining, we'll talk pay. You screw around or get scared off by a bear, I walk away and pretend I never met you." Ethan hesitated, just a second, but then he nodded. "When do we start?" Walter grinned. "Sun's up at 6. Meet me at the trailhead behind my house. Don't be late. Forest don't wait for slow feet." Ethan lay on the mattress he'd dragged into the cleanest corner of the bedroom. There was no ceiling fan, just the chorus of crickets outside the cracked window and the occasional hoot of an owl. A job. Real work. Outside. Breathing pine and mud instead of dust and decay. He didn't know if he'd make it. But for the first time in a long time, he had something to look forward to. Tomorrow, the woods would be waiting. The morning mist still clung to the ground when Ethan reached the trailhead behind Walter Briggs's property. A battered green pickup was parked nearby, its bed loaded with sacks of feed, a toolbox, and something that looked like a pair of old snowshoes. Walter was already there, pouring coffee from a dented thermos. He didn't say good morning, just handed Ethan a second cup and pointed to the gear in the bed. "Grab the feed sack and the red pack. You're carrying both today." Ethan slung the heavy bag over his shoulder, adjusted the straps of the pack, and followed Walter into the trees. The trail was narrow, almost swallowed by fern and pine. Birdsong echoed above them. High, rhythmic calls Ethan couldn't name. Branches creaked. Somewhere in the distance, a brook murmured under the cover of rocks. Walter moved with the silent confidence of someone who had walked this forest for decades. Ethan, on the other hand, stumbled twice within the first 10 minutes. Once on a route, once in a muddy hole he hadn't noticed. "You're walking too fast," Walter said without looking back. "This ain't a race. Forest ain't about speed. It's about listening." They stopped in a clearing beside a broken fence. Walter pointed to the ground. "See those tracks?" Ethan squinted. "Deer." "Good. And?" He looked again. Smaller prints, sharp-toed. "Coyote." Walter gave a single approving nod. "They've been sniffing around the salt licks. Time to move them deeper in." Animals are getting too used to humans. They hiked another hour, refilling feeders, checking salt blocks, and logging notes in Walter's stained field journal. When Ethan asked why he didn't just use an app, Walter snorted. Phones die, paper doesn't. By noon, Ethan's shoulders were sore, his shirt soaked in sweat, and his boots caked with mud. But he hadn't quit. Walter noticed. "You don't talk much," he said, as they sat on a log, eating sandwiches in silence. Ethan shrugged. "People usually don't want to listen." Walter chewed thoughtfully. "People ain't the forest." That afternoon, they came across their first snare, a wire loop rigged low across a game trail, half hidden by leaves. "Poacher," Walter said flatly, lazy kind. He showed Ethan how to disarm the trap, then mark the spot on the map. "Don't touch these unless you're sure, and always look twice. Sometimes they set backups, nasty ones." They found 3 more snares before sundown. One had caught a raccoon, still alive, but terrified. Ethan watched as Walter carefully cut the wire and released it. The raccoon bolted into the brush. "No blood," Walter muttered. "Lucky little bastard." They reached Walter's truck as twilight painted the sky in deep pink and gold. Ethan's legs felt like lead. His shoulders ached, but he was still standing. Walter lit a cigarette, leaning against the truck. "You did all right today." "Thanks." "You're green, but not stupid. That's rare." Ethan half smiled, unsure whether it was a compliment. Walter nodded toward the trees. "You come back tomorrow. It means you're serious." Ethan looked out over the woods, the sun slipping below the pine line. "I'll be here." Ethan's boots sank softly into the damp earth as he followed Walter deeper into the forest. The early morning sun filtered through towering pine needles, casting mottled shadows on the forest floor, carpeted with ferns and moss. The scent of pine sap and wet soil was sharp and alive. Walter walked with a practiced ease, scanning the ground and occasionally pausing to crouch by a fallen branch or a patch of disturbed dirt. Ethan struggled to keep pace, his lungs burning from the climb over uneven terrain. "Look here," Walter said, kneeling beside a set of prints. "See how these are spaced? That tells you it's a buck, moving steady, not running." Ethan crouched next to him, tracing the outline of the hoof with his fingers. He felt something shift inside, a flicker of connection, a new kind of belonging he hadn't known before. "Why do you care so much about these tracks?" Ethan asked. Walter's eyes twinkled beneath bushy brows. "Because every trail tells a story, kid. The forest talks if you listen. And those who don't get lost, or worse." They moved quietly, spotting bird nests, a burrow tucked beneath a fallen log, the tangled remains of a raccoon's meal. Walter explained each sign, teaching Ethan to read the forest like a book written in shadows and scents. Suddenly, Walter held up a hand, signaling silence, Ahead, they spotted a cluster of traps. Crude snares rigged to catch deer and smaller game. Some were freshly set. Others showed signs of use. Poachers, Walter growled softly. Scars on the forest's skin. He gestured for Ethan to help disarm the traps. The wires bit at their fingers, but they worked methodically, removing the snares without disturbing the ground too much. You have to be careful, Walter warned. One wrong move, and you could hurt the very creatures you're trying to save. Hours passed. Ethan's muscles ached, but the weight of his bag and the sharp, clean air filled him with something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. As the sun began to dip behind the pines, they made their way back to the truck. "Not bad for your third day," Walter said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. "You've got grit." Ethan looked out over the endless sea of trees, shadows deepening, and smiled. Maybe, just maybe, he'd found a place where he belonged. The sun was high and hot when Ethan stepped into the small town centre of Red Pine Hollow. The few scattered buildings stood silent under the relentless heat. The post office, a diner with peeling paint, a dusty general store, and the old water pump by the corner. Ethan had come to fill his empty jug, the one he carried everywhere since the house's tap barely dribbled. The rusty pump groaned as he cranked it, water sputtering before flowing clear and cool. "You're the new kid," a soft voice said beside him. Ethan turned to see a girl, maybe a few years younger, with dark hair pulled back in a loose braid and eyes bright as morning sky. She wore a light blue dress, simple but clean, and smiled warmly. "Grace," she said, offering her hand. Ethan shook it, surprised but pleased. "I've seen you around," she said, "but you don't say much." "Not much to say," Ethan shrugged. Grace laughed. But Grace's warmth was tempered by a shadow. "My dad," she said quietly. "He doesn't like new people, especially not ones like you." Ethan looked at her, curiosity and concern knotting in his chest. "Who's your dad?" he asked. "The town chairman, Gerald Whittaker. Powerful, controlling. He keeps this place locked tight." Ethan nodded slowly, feeling the weight of unspoken rules settling around them like a heavy fog. "But I don't care," Grace said firmly. "I want to know you." Ethan smiled, a real smile, bright and hopeful. Maybe this strange, forgotten town wasn't so lonely after all. The days after meeting Grace felt different for Ethan. Warmer, brighter, even as the shadows of Red Pine Hollow crept closer. He and Grace met whenever they could, at the water pump, under the ancient oak tree by the schoolyard, or on quiet trails where no one could hear. Their friendship blossomed quickly, filled with laughter and whispered secrets. But no secret stays hidden for long in a small town. One evening, Ethan stood at the edge of the diner parking lot, when he saw a tall man with a heavy presence approach Grace as she walked home. Gerald Whittaker, the very man Grace had warned him about. His eyes, sharp and cold, fixed on Ethan like a predator spotting prey. The next day, Grace didn't come to meet him. The day after that, silence. Then a note slipped under Ethan's door. "Stay away from my daughter." The words hit him like a punch. Fear, anger, helplessness, all swirling inside. Ethan tried to call Grace, but her number was disconnected. He stopped by her house once, watching from the shadows as Gerald barred the door, his face a mask of fury. "Why is he so afraid of me?" Ethan wondered aloud to Walter one evening. Walter took a long drag from his pipe and exhaled slowly. "Because you represent everything Gerald fears. Change, truth, and maybe justice." Ethan clenched his fists. He wasn't about to give up. If Grace was worth it, he'd find a way through the walls Gerald built. It was a damp morning when Ethan set out alone, his breath visible in the cool air as he followed a narrow, twisting trail deeper into the forest. Walter had called in sick, his back protesting the hard work, so Ethan took it upon himself to check the outer boundaries. The forest grew denser, shadows thickening beneath the towering pines. His boots crunched over a carpet of needles. Suddenly, the trees parted onto a small clearing where an eerie sight caught Ethan's eye. The rusted wreckage of a crop duster plane, half buried under moss and leaves. Its faded green paint peeled, windows shattered, and the tail twisted awkwardly into the earth. Heart pounding, Ethan approached cautiously. Inside the broken cockpit lay a battered duffel bag, sealed but worn with age. Nearby, scattered fragments of fabric and what looked like torn documents fluttered in the light breeze. He knelt and unzipped the bag, revealing something heavy wrapped in oilskin. Carefully peeling it back, Ethan's eyes widened as gold nuggets gleamed in the dim light, nestled among faded papers. Pulling out a folded, plastic-wrapped object, he found a yellowed passport, the photo unmistakably that of Gerald Whittaker, the man who ruled the town. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. If this was Gerald's, whose remains lay outside the wreck? Nearby, half hidden beneath fallen branches, a weathered skeleton lay sprawled, the skull cracked open. Questions swirled in Ethan's mind. This discovery could shake the entire town. He packed the duffel and documents carefully, determined to tell Walter as soon as possible. Back at Walter's weathered cabin, Ethan laid out the duffel's contents on the old wooden table. The gold nuggets caught the fading light, their gleam both mesmerizing and ominous. The worn passport sat beside them, its plastic wrapper now torn, the photo unmistakable. Gerald Whittaker, town chairman. Walter stroked his greying beard, eyes narrowing. "I haven't seen this in decades." Ethan looked up, eyebrows raised. "You know this guy?" Walter sighed heavily. Gerald's got a twin brother, Douglas. Not many around here remember, but he was trouble. A convicted felon, fresh out of prison about 20 years ago, when a gold heist shook the county. "What happened to Douglas?" Ethan asked. "Vanished without a trace," Walter replied. "Some say he ran off with the loot. Others whisper worse." Ethan's mind raced. So the man running the town might not be who he says he is. Walter nodded grimly. The real Gerald died in a plane crash years ago. Douglas took his place, pretending to be his brother, kept the gold hidden to cover his tracks. The weight of the secret pressed down on Ethan's shoulders. "We need to take this to the sheriff," Walter said firmly. Ethan agreed. The town deserves to know the truth. As night settled, the two men prepared for what would come next. A reckoning, buried deep in the woods, now uncovered by a young man who refused to stay invisible. The sheriff's office smelled of old coffee and worn leather. Ethan and Walter sat across from Sheriff Daniels, who studied the faded passport and the gold nuggets laid out on his desk. "This is serious," the sheriff said, running a hand through thinning grey hair. "If what you are saying is true, it changes everything about this town." A tense summons was sent to Gerald Whittaker. When the man arrived, his posture stiffened, his eyes darted nervously. Sheriff Daniels laid out the evidence: the wrecked plane, the gold, the passport, and the remains found in the woods. Under mounting pressure, Gerald's face twisted from anger to defeat. With a shaky voice, he confessed the truth. He was not Gerald Whittaker, but Douglas, Gerald's twin brother. Years ago, after Gerald's mysterious disappearance, Douglas took his identity to escape his past and control the town's affairs. Tattooed marks peeked from under his shirt, unmistakable signs of prison life. The town chairman, W. Sheriff Daniels sighed, his expression heavy. "We'll be pressing charges, but the gold will be returned to the state." Ethan felt a surge of relief and unease. Justice was beginning, but the fallout would ripple through the community for years. Grace, learning the truth, reached out to Ethan. Their bond, once forbidden, now stronger than ever. The town of Red Pine Hollow would never be the same, with Douglas Whittaker's arrest shaking the foundation of Red Pine Hollow. The town slowly began to breathe again. The stolen gold was returned to the state, and Ethan received a modest reward. Enough to plant the seeds for a new life. Grace stood by his side as the weight of the past lifted, their bond stronger and more determined. Their love, once forbidden, now blossomed openly. Ethan invested the reward money into starting a poultry farm on the outskirts of town. A modest operation, but one with promise. Early mornings were filled with the soft clucks of hens, the smell of fresh earth, and the hope of growth. The townspeople, once skeptical, began to respect Ethan. They saw a young man who worked hard, who cared for the land and the community. Walter Briggs, proud and grizzled, still guided Ethan, though now more as a mentor and friend than a strict teacher. One crisp autumn evening, under a sky full of stars, Ethan knelt in the field where he and Grace dreamed of raising a family and building a future together. "I want us to be more than just survivors," he said softly. "I want us to be home." Grace smiled, her hand in his. "We already are." The once rickety house at the edge of Red Pine Hollow had transformed into a warm, welcoming home. Ethan and Grace spent months repairing the walls, painting rooms, and planting a garden that bloomed bright with tomatoes, peppers, and wildflowers. The poultry farm flourished, and with every egg collected, Ethan felt more rooted in the soil beneath his feet. Neighbours stopped by more often now, bringing small gifts or just sharing stories over the fence. The old suspicion that once shadowed Ethan's arrival melted into a quiet respect. One summer morning, as sunlight spilled golden across the porch, Grace cradled their newborn twins, a boy and a girl, their tiny hands grasping at the world with innocent curiosity. Ethan watched, heart full, knowing the long road had been worth every hardship. Walter, sitting in his rocking chair, tipped his hat with a proud grin. "You made it, kid!" Ethan smiled, looking out at the forest that had become both a challenge and a sanctuary. "Yes, Walter," he said softly. "I finally made it home. If you like the story, I would be very happy to have your support. Click the thumbs up. And to not miss new stories, subscribe and click on the bell. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and all the best."